Kicked out by her foster parents at just 22, Megan Parker had nowhere to go and only $2,700 left to her name. Desperate for a place no one could take away from her, she spent $200 on an abandoned Vermont farmhouse nobody had wanted for nearly 40 years. Everyone thought she had bought a worthless ruin. But beneath the basement floor, Megan discovered a hidden vault sealed for decades. And what was inside wouldn't just change her life. It would bring people back who had disappeared when she had nothing. Before we go any further, if you believe everyone deserves a second chance and a place to call home, subscribe and stay with us. Because Megan's story is only beginning. Megan Parker had spent so much of her childhood moving from one home to another that she developed a habit she never talked about. She never completely unpacked. A toothbrush could sit beside the sink. A jacket could hang behind the door. But a few shirts always stayed folded inside her suitcase. Just in case. Megan lost her parents young and spent years in foster care before a couple took her in at 15. For 7 years, she tried to become the kind of daughter nobody would regret keeping. She rarely asked for money, worked after school, and eventually found a job at a small garage. An older mechanic noticed how carefully she watched him work and began teaching her hand tools, small engines, and basic welding. Megan wasn't a contractor, but she learned one lesson she never forgot. Broken didn't always mean finished. By 22, she had saved $2,700. Then, one evening, an argument about work, money, and Megan's future ended with her foster father saying quietly, "Megan, you're 22. We can't keep carrying you forever." He probably never realized what those words would mean to a girl who had spent 7 years trying to make sure she was never too heavy to carry. Megan didn't argue. She went upstairs and packed 2 bags. Then she noticed something that hurt more than the argument. Half her clothes were already inside the suitcase. After 7 years, she had never completely unpacked. 6 nights later, Megan was sleeping in her pickup when she found a Caldwell County listing 11 acres outside Ash Grove, Vermont, with an abandoned farmhouse nobody had wanted for nearly 40 years. Price $2,100. If she bought it, she would have only $600 left. It was a terrible plan. She knew that. But every other plan still depended on someone else deciding whether she could stay. So Megan drove north and signed the deed. When she finally reached Birch Hollow Road, the farmhouse was worse than the photograph. Part of this porch had collapsed. Windows were broken, saplings grew through the old boards, and the barn leaned toward the trees. For several minutes, Megan remained behind the wheel. $600. No family coming to help. No backup plan if she failed. Then she looked at the abandoned farmhouse again. Nobody wanted it. Megan knew something about being looked at that way. She climbed carefully onto the porch and unlocked the front door. Inside were peeling plaster, damaged floors, 40 years of dust, and silence. But for the first time in Megan's life, nobody else could decide whether she was allowed to stay. She carried in her toolbox, then her 2 suitcases. Megan knelt on the dusty floor, opened both bags, and slowly took everything out. Every shirt, every pair of jeans, everything. For the first time she could remember, Megan Parker completely unpacked. She didn't know whether $600 would last through the month, whether the roof would survive another storm, or whether her pickup would start tomorrow. And she certainly didn't know that somewhere beneath the floors of the house, Walter Pewitt had left something hidden nearly 40 years earlier. But before Megan could discover what the farmhouse was hiding, she had a more urgent problem. Could she keep it standing long enough to finally call it home? The first week on Birch Hollow Road taught Megan something the county paperwork had not. Buying a house and having a home were 2 very different things. She slept in the pickup for the first 3 nights because the front room still smelled of damp plaster, and something had been nesting in the kitchen long enough to consider the place its own. During the day, Megan worked. She cut brush away from the porch, covered the worst section of the roof with a heavy tarp, pulled rotten boards one at a time, and marked the dangerous floorboards with pieces of red tape. And every evening, she counted what remained of her $600. The number frightened her more each time. At the hardware store, Gideon Marsh watched her purchases accumulate on the counterwork gloves, nails, roofing patches, kerosene, a pry bar. "You planning on doing that whole place yourself?" "Only the parts I know how to do." That answer seemed to matter to him. Gideon looked at her for a moment, then removed the cheap blue tarp from her pile and replaced it with a heavier one. "Wind off that ridge will tear the first one apart." Megan checked the price. "I can't afford this one." "Then pay me later." She started to protest. Gideon was already writing something in a small notebook. "Pay me when the house is worth something." It was not charity offered with a smile. That made it easier to accept. 2 doors down, Ruth Calloway ran a diner with 4 booths, 6 counter stools, and the kind of coffee that seemed to have been brewing since sunrise. When Ruth learned Megan had bought the old Pewitt place, she asked only one question. "You eaten today?" Megan hadn't. Ruth brought her eggs, toast, and potatoes. When Megan reached for her wallet, Ruth shook her head. "Kitchen made too much." Megan looked around the nearly empty diner. She knew perfectly well the kitchen had not made too much. But she also understood what Ruth was giving her. Not pity. A way to accept help without having to feel small. By the end of the second week, Megan's hands were blistered despite the gloves. Her shoulders hurt when she lifted them. At night, she lay inside the farmhouse beneath a sleeping bag, listening to rain strike the tarp overhead. Some nights she wondered whether her foster parents had been right. Maybe wanting independence and being ready for it were not the same thing. Then one cold morning, her pickup wouldn't start. Megan turned the key. "Nothing." She tried again. A weak click. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel. The truck was transportation, shelter when the house became unsafe, and the only way she could reach town for supplies. She had less than $300 left now. For perhaps 30 seconds, Megan did absolutely nothing. Then she opened the hood. An hour later, with cold fingers and grease across one cheek, she found the problem in a corroded battery connection. When the engine finally turned over, Megan laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes relief has nowhere else to go. That afternoon, she returned to the farmhouse and kept working. There were things she couldn't fix. The electrical system would need a professional. Parts of the roof were beyond anything she should attempt alone. But there were things she could do. And each repaired board was one small argument against the idea that she had made a mistake. A few days later, Megan finally began clearing the basement. It was low and cold, with fieldstone walls and decades of ruined shelving, cardboard, and dirt. Near the rear wall was a section of poured concrete that looked newer than everything around it. Megan dragged away the last piece of collapsed shelving. Her pry bar slipped from her hand. It struck the concrete. Thud. She bent to pick it up, then stopped. Something about the sound bothered her. Megan tapped the floor with the metal bar. Thud. She moved a foot to the left. Thud. Then closer to the rear wall. Tok. Megan froze. She struck the same spot again. Tok. Hollow. She crouched and ran her fingers over the concrete. The section was roughly 3 feet by 4 feet. Maybe an old cistern. Maybe a crawl space. Maybe nothing important at all. Megan had learned at the garage not to invent an answer before understanding the problem. So she didn't break through it. Not yet. That night, rain moved across Birch Hollow, and the wind pulled at the tarp above her. But for the first time since she had arrived, Megan wasn't lying awake thinking about the money disappearing from her account. She was thinking about that sound. About Walter Pewitt. About a farmhouse that had stood empty for almost 40 years. And about one question she could no longer put out of her mind. Why would anyone pour 4 inches of concrete over an empty space beneath their own house. Megan waited 2 days before touching the concrete again. Part of her wanted to break through it immediately. The other part, the part trained by years of having very little, knew that curiosity could become expensive if you were careless. So she measured first. The hollow section was roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, set close to the basement's rear wall. The concrete there was different from the surrounding floor. Smoother, newer. Someone had poured it later. And they had done it for a reason. Megan borrowed a masonry hammer and chisel from Gideon. When he asked what she needed them for, she hesitated. Found something strange in the basement. Gideon raised an eyebrow. At the Puitt place, strange comes with the property. Megan smiled, but she didn't tell him more. The next morning, she started carefully along one edge. It took nearly 2 hours before the first piece came loose. Beneath the concrete was darkness. Not dirt, not stone, empty space. Megan widened the opening until she could shine a flashlight inside. A small chamber had been built beneath the floor. Her heartbeat quickened. She removed another piece. Then another. Finally, Megan lowered herself through the opening. The chamber was barely large enough to kneel in. The air smelled dry and stale. Against one wall sat an old military ammunition box wrapped in deteriorating plastic. Beside it were 2 wooden boxes and several bundles of papers. For a moment, Megan simply stared. Then she opened the ammunition box. Inside were stacks of old bills. She didn't count them. Not yet. She just sat there looking at money that had apparently been hidden beneath the house longer than she had been alive. The first wooden box was heavier. Inside were rows of silver dollars, darkened with age but unmistakable. The second held old financial certificates and documents. Megan felt something cold move through her stomach. This wasn't somebody's forgotten coffee can. Someone had deliberately hidden these things. Carefully, she turned to the papers. There were envelopes with names written across the front. Faraday, Donnelly, Whitcomb. Dozens more. Some contained mortgage documents. Others contained handwritten notes and payment records. Then Megan found the ledger. It was thick, cloth-bound, and filled with dates, names, dollar amounts, and short notations written in the same careful hand. She didn't understand most of it, but she understood enough to know she should stop touching things. At the garage, she'd been taught something simple. When you don't understand what you're looking at, don't pretend you do. Megan climbed out of the chamber and called Cornelius Bates, a local attorney whose name Gideon had given her for property questions. Cornelius arrived that afternoon. He spent nearly 20 minutes examining the documents before saying much. Don't sell anything. I wasn't planning to. Don't spend the cash. Don't clean the coins. Don't give anyone anything. And don't start telling people what you found. Megan nodded. Then Cornelius picked up a folded document from beneath the ledger. He opened it carefully across an old workbench. His expression changed. What? He didn't answer immediately. The document was dated 1968. It was a deed. The name Walter Puitt appeared on it, and the legal description referred to approximately 40 acres adjoining the 11 Megan had just purchased. It was signed, Cornelius said quietly, notarized, too. So Walter owned more land. Maybe. Cornelius pointed toward the recording information. This is where things get complicated. The deed appeared never to have been properly recorded. Megan looked toward the basement ceiling. 11 acres had already seemed impossible to her. Now there might be 40 more. But something bothered her. Why hide the deed? Cornelius looked at the cash, the coins, and the ledger. That's not the only question I'd be asking. That evening, after he left, Megan sat alone on the farmhouse steps. She had less than $300 available to live on. Behind her was a house that still leaked when it rained. and beneath her feet sat enough money and documents to possibly change her life. But strangely, the money wasn't what she kept thinking about. It was the envelopes, the names, the ledger, and a man who had apparently sealed all of it beneath concrete, and then disappeared. Megan looked across the darkening fields. For most of her life, she'd believed that having money meant having security. Walter Puett had apparently possessed plenty of it, yet he'd hidden it underground and walked away. Why? The answer would come from an elderly woman in Ashgrove who recognized one of the names in that ledger. And when she told Megan who Walter Puett really was, the hidden vault would stop looking like a treasure chest. It would start looking like a message. The elderly woman was Eleanor Voss, a retired librarian who had spent more than 30 years preserving the history of Caldwell County. Her house stood near the edge of Ashgrove, crowded with books, old photographs, newspaper clippings, and filing cabinets labeled by decade. When Megan placed photographs of the ledger and envelopes on Eleanor's kitchen table, the older woman adjusted her glasses. At first, she said nothing. Then her finger stopped on one name. Faraday? Eleanor went completely still. Where did you get this? Under the farmhouse. The Puett place. Megan nodded. Eleanor slowly sat back. My mother was a Faraday. That was the beginning. Over coffee that went cold between them, Eleanor told Megan what little Ashgrove still remembered about Walter Puett. Most people had thought he was simply a strange, private man with money. He lived alone, drove an old truck, wore work shirts until the elbows gave out. Then, one day, he was gone. But Eleanor had spent years finding pieces of a different story. During the agricultural downturn of the 1970s, several farming families around Ashgrove had fallen behind on their mortgages. Banks were preparing to foreclose. Farms that had been passed from father to son for generations were weeks away from being lost. Walter began quietly purchasing some of those troubled mortgage notes. Megan frowned. So he bought their debts. Yes. Then he owned their farms. He could have... Eleanor emphasized the last three words. He could have... But Walter never forced the families off their land. Instead, he allowed them to stay. Some made small payments when they could. Some apparently made almost none. Then Eleanor pulled an old folder from a cabinet. Inside was a photocopy of a letter. The original had belonged to her grandfather. Eleanor slid it across the table. Megan read the few lines twice. Walter Puett had informed the Faraday family that their remaining debt had been forgiven. No explanation. No conditions. No request for recognition. My grandfather almost lost his farm, Eleanor said. There were 4 children in that house. My mother was the youngest. She looked toward the photograph of the ledger. If Walter hadn't stepped in, I don't know where they would have gone. Megan thought about the names she had found beneath the basement. Faraday, Donnelly, Whitcomb. They weren't investment records. They were families. How many did he help? Eleanor shook her head. Nobody ever knew. They spent the afternoon comparing the ledger with old county records and newspaper clippings. Again and again, the pattern appeared. A family got into trouble. A mortgage changed hands. Walter's name appeared. Then foreclosure never came. The more Megan learned, the less the money beneath her farmhouse felt like treasure. Walter had possessed something Megan had spent her entire life believing would solve everything. Money. Enough of it to make people listen. Enough to buy land. Enough to protect himself. But Walter seemed to have measured wealth differently. He used it to give people time. Time to recover. Time to keep working. Time to remain in the homes where their children had grown up. On the drive back to Birch Hollow, Megan barely noticed the road. She kept thinking about the night her foster parents told her to leave. For years, Megan had believed a home was something another person allowed you to have. Then she bought the farmhouse and decided a home was something you owned. Something with your name on the deed. Something nobody could take away simply because they changed their mind. But Walter's story suggested something deeper. Maybe a home wasn't only about ownership. Maybe it was also about dignity. About being allowed to stand on your own feet without someone making you feel ashamed for needing a little more time. Suddenly, Megan understood Gideon's heavier tarp. Ruth's extra plate of food. Neither had tried to rescue her. Neither had demanded gratitude. They had simply made the road a little less steep while Megan climbed it herself. That evening, she stood outside the farmhouse as the last light disappeared behind the Vermont ridge. The house was still broken. Her bank account was still frighteningly small. The legal questions surrounding the hidden property had barely begun. Yet something inside Megan had changed. When she first opened the vault, part of her had wondered whether she'd finally found enough money to make sure she would never need anyone again. Now that thought embarrassed her a little. Walter Puett had spent years proving the opposite. Maybe strength wasn't reaching a point where you needed nobody. Maybe strength was having enough and choosing not to close your hand around all of it. Megan looked back at the farmhouse. A man who had once helped families keep their homes had somehow, nearly 40 years later, left behind a house that gave a homeless 22-year-old girl somewhere to begin again. She didn't know whether that was coincidence. She wasn't sure it mattered. But for the first time, Megan stopped asking herself, "What did Walter leave me?" and began asking a different question. What am I supposed to do with what he left behind? She would not have long to consider the answer. Because once word of the discovery reached beyond Ashgrove, people began paying attention to Megan Parker. And among them were people who had shown very little interest in her when all she owned was $2,700, an old pickup, and 2 suitcases. For the next several weeks, Megan's life existed in 2 very different worlds. In one, lawyers examined deeds, signatures, tax records, and everything Walter Puett had hidden beneath the farmhouse. In the other, Megan still woke up every morning in a house with unfinished walls and a roof that leaked in 2 places. Cornelius Bates had been clear from the beginning. Until we know what legally belongs to you, don't touch it. So Megan didn't. She didn't spend the cash. She didn't sell the silver dollars. And she certainly didn't behave like someone who had suddenly become rich. Instead, she kept working. Eventually, after the first portion of the property was legally cleared, Megan finally had enough breathing room to make the farmhouse safer. She hired a licensed electrician for the work she knew better than to attempt herself. Gideon helped her find reasonably priced lumber. A retired roofer from outside Ashgrove showed her which sections she could repair and which ones needed experienced hands. Megan paid when she could. And when neighbors needed something she knew how to fix, she returned the favor. A lawnmower came first. Then a generator. Then an old snowblower that Gideon claimed had been dead since Reagan was president. Megan got it running. Word spread. Soon, people began leaving small engines and farm equipment beside the barn with handwritten notes attached. The old barn slowly became a workshop. Nothing fancy. A scarred workbench. Second-hand tools. A radio that only received 2 stations clearly. But it was work Megan understood. And for the first time, people were coming to her because she had something useful to offer. Something changed in Ashgrove after that. She stopped hearing people refer to her as the young foster girl who bought the abandoned Puett place. At the diner, someone would ask, "Has Megan from Birch Hollow looked at that mower yet?" Megan from Birch Hollow. The first time she heard it, she didn't say anything. But the words stayed with her all day. She had spent most of her childhood being identified by where she had temporarily been placed. Now people were identifying her by where she belonged. Then the newspaper story appeared. A reporter from the county paper had heard rumors about old documents discovered at the Puett property. Megan agreed to speak with him only after Cornelius assured her the essential facts were already part of the public filings. The story ran on a Sunday. By Wednesday, Cornelius called. "We have a problem." A man claiming to be a distant relative of Walter Puett had hired an attorney in New York. He was questioning whether the contents of the hidden chamber should have transferred with the property at all. Megan felt the old fear return immediately. The fear that something she had finally begun to trust could still be taken away. Cornelius heard the silence. "Don't panic. A claim isn't the same thing as a right." Megan thanked him and went back to work. Then, 2 days later, another letter arrived. There was no law firm's name on this envelope. Megan recognized the handwriting. She stood beside the mailbox for nearly a minute before opening it. Her foster mother wrote that they had seen the newspaper article. They had been thinking about Megan. They regretted how things had ended. They worried that she was facing complicated financial and legal decisions alone. Near the end was a sentence Megan read 3 times. "We still think of you as our daughter." For 7 years, those words would have meant everything to her. Even now, some part of her wanted to believe them. That was what hurt. Because Megan did not think her foster parents were monsters. People were rarely that simple. Maybe they did miss her. Maybe they had regretted that night. Maybe they had convinced themselves that forcing her out had been the only way to make her independent. But Megan couldn't ignore the timing. When she had left their driveway with 2 suitcases and $2,700, they knew she had nowhere permanent to go. They had not come looking. When she spent 6 nights sleeping in her pickup, no letter arrived. But now her name was in the newspaper beside words like hidden money, silver, and 40 acres. And suddenly they knew exactly where to find her. That evening, Megan sat alone on the front steps with the letter folded beside her. Across the yard, warm light spilled from the barn. Gideon had dropped off a mower earlier. Ruth had sent soup in a covered container because the temperature was supposed to fall overnight. Neither had ever asked Megan what the vault was worth. Neither had asked what they might receive from it. Megan looked at the farmhouse behind her. For years, she had believed being wanted was the same thing as being loved. Now she was beginning to understand there was a difference between someone wanting you and someone wanting what had suddenly gathered around you. A week later, another message came. Her foster parents wanted to visit Birch Hollow. Megan stared at the phone for a long time before answering. Finally, she typed 3 words. "You can come?" Then she set the phone down. The girl who had once spent 7 years afraid of being asked to leave was about to stand at the door of her own home and decide for herself who would be allowed inside. Megan's foster parents arrived on Birch Hollow Road on a gray Saturday afternoon. She recognized their car before it reached the house. For a moment, she was 22 and 15 at the same time. 15-year-old Megan wanted to run down the porch steps. She wanted to hear that they were sorry, that they had missed her, that the night they told her to leave had been a terrible mistake. But 22-year-old Megan stayed where she was. The car stopped. Her foster mother stepped out first, then her foster father. Neither of them spoke immediately. They were looking at the farmhouse. The porch had been repaired. New shingles covered part of the roof. Smoke rose from the chimney. Across the yard, the old barn stood straighter than it had the day Megan arrived. There were 2 lawn mowers waiting outside the workshop, and Gideon's old truck parked near the fence. Her foster father finally said, "You've done a lot." Megan nodded. "I've had help." That answer surprised even her. Months earlier, she might have been ashamed to admit it. Now she understood that accepting help was not the same as being helpless. Inside, Megan made coffee. Her foster mother looked around the kitchen. "We were worried about you." Megan held her cup with both hands. "When?" The question was quiet. Her foster mother looked down. "We didn't handle things well." Her foster father leaned forward. "We thought you needed a push. You were 22, Megan. We thought making you stand on your own would be good for you." "Maybe you did." Megan meant it. That was what made the conversation harder. She didn't need them to be villains anymore. People could love you and still hurt you. They could believe they were teaching independence while never understanding how abandonment felt to someone who had already spent a childhood being passed from home to home. Her foster mother reached across the table. "When we read about the money and the land, we thought you might need someone you could trust." There it was. Not greed exactly. Not entirely. Something more complicated. Concern tangled with regret. And perhaps, somewhere inside it, an interest in what Megan suddenly possessed. Months ago, Megan would have been terrified to question their motives. Now she wasn't. "Did you want to come before you read the article?" Neither answered. Megan felt the old ache, but it no longer felt like a hole she needed them to fill. She looked around the kitchen. Gideon had helped repair the door frame. Ruth's soup was still in the refrigerator. A neighbor had traded firewood for Megan repairing his generator. This house was filled with evidence of people who had shown up before there was anything to gain. Megan finally understood the difference. "I don't hate you," she said. Her foster mother began to cry. "And I'm not saying you can never come back." Megan paused. "But if you come back, I need it to be because you want to know me, not because there's money under my house, not because there might be 51 acres, and not because you think I need someone to take control." Her foster father looked wounded. "We never said that." "No, but I need to say it." For once, Megan didn't soften the truth, simply because someone else was uncomfortable hearing it. Her voice remained calm. "If you want to call me and ask whether I'm okay, call me. If you want to have dinner someday, ask. Maybe we can figure out what we are to each other now." Then she looked at both of them. "But my money is mine, the property is mine, and the decisions about my life are mine." The room stayed quiet. Finally, her foster mother nodded. It wasn't reconciliation. Not yet. But perhaps it was something more honest. When they left, Megan stood on the porch and watched their car disappear between the trees. She expected to feel victorious. Instead, she felt sad and relieved and strangely peaceful. That evening, Gideon found her in the barn working on an old generator. "How'd it go?" Megan tightened a bolt. "I think I finally stopped waiting for them to choose me." Gideon didn't offer advice. He simply handed her the wrench she was reaching for. Weeks later, Cornelius called with better news. The distant relative's claim was weakening. The documents showed no clear legal right to Walter's hidden property, and the process concerning the additional 40 acres was moving forward. But Megan noticed something surprising. The news didn't affect her the way it once would have. When she first discovered the vault, she thought security meant having enough money that nobody could ever hurt her again. Now she knew better. Security wasn't a number in an account. It was knowing how to work, knowing when to ask for help, knowing who showed up when you had nothing, and knowing that forgiveness did not require surrendering the keys to your life. That night, Megan locked the workshop and walked toward the farmhouse. The windows glowed warmly against the Vermont darkness. For the first time. She didn't think of it as the house nobody wanted. She didn't think of herself that way anymore, either. Some things weren't abandoned because they had no value. Sometimes they were simply waiting for someone willing to see what was still worth saving. By early fall, the legal questions surrounding Walter Pewett's property were finally beginning to settle. Cornelius called Megan one morning while she was replacing a belt on an old riding mower. "The claim is finished," he said. Megan stopped working. "The relative. Withdrawn? And the quiet title process on the adjoining land is complete." There was a pause. "Those 40 acres are legally yours." Megan looked through the open barn doors toward the ridge. 11 acres had once seemed more than she could imagine owning. Now there were 51. A few months earlier, news like that might have made her feel safe for the first time. Instead, Megan found herself thinking about responsibility. Not long afterward, a timber company contacted her. The representative was polite. The offer was substantial. There was mature hardwood on the ridge, and harvesting it could give Megan more money than she had ever seen. For a 22-year-old who had recently counted every dollar before buying groceries, The decision should have been easy. But Megan walked the property before answering. She followed an old logging trail through maple and birch, past stone walls built by hands long gone. She thought about Walter. He had owned things people wanted. Money, land, leverage, and when given the opportunity to use another person's hardship for his own benefit, he had chosen something else. So Megan made her decision. Most of the woodland would remain standing. She allowed limited selective harvesting on a small section, enough to finance repairs to the barn without stripping the ridge. Then she put the money back into Birch Hollow. The barn got a sound roof, safe wiring, better lighting, a second-hand welding table, shelves for tools. Nothing about it was fancy. But people began coming. At first, they were neighbors bringing machines that needed repair. Then teenagers started appearing. Some were interested in engines. Some wanted to learn welding. Others seemed to have no particular interest in tools at all. They simply discovered that nobody hurried them out the door. Megan understood those kids, so she never asked too many questions. She gave them work instead. Hold this. Try that wrench. Listen to the engine. What do you hear? One boy in particular began showing up regularly. He was 16, quiet, and better at understanding machines than he seemed to realize. The first time Megan handed him a carburetor to clean, he told her he would probably ruin it. You might, Megan said. The boy stared at her. Then Megan smiled. And if you do, we'll figure out why. It was something an older mechanic had once done for her. Not rescue. Not praise she hadn't earned. Just permission to try. That winter, Megan stood in the workshop one evening and watched the boy repair a small engine almost entirely by himself. Gideon was drinking coffee near the heater. Ruth had sent over a pan of cornbread. The radio was playing softly beneath the sound of tools. Megan looked around the barn and suddenly remembered the first afternoon she had arrived on Birch Hollow Road. $600. A leaking roof. 2 suitcases. Nobody coming to save her. She had believed then that independence meant never needing anyone again. She had been wrong. Walter had taught her that. So had Gideon. So had Ruth. A good community didn't make you weak by helping you. It gave you enough solid ground to become strong enough to help the next person. The farmhouse changed too. The porch no longer sagged. The windows held against the winter wind. Smoke rose from the chimney on cold mornings. But Megan never restored everything until it looked new. She left some of the old beams exposed. She kept Walter's scarred workbench. There were marks in the floor that no amount of sanding could completely remove. Megan liked them. They reminded her that repair was not the same thing as erasing what happened. Something could carry its scars and still become useful again. Maybe people could too. One evening, after everyone had gone, Megan walked from the barn toward the farmhouse. Snow had begun falling over Birch Hollow. Warm light filled the windows. She stopped in the yard and looked at the place nobody had wanted for nearly 40 years. Then she thought about the frightened young woman who had arrived there, believing the greatest gift anyone could give her was a place no one could make her leave. Megan understood differently now. A home wasn't only somewhere you were allowed to stay. It was somewhere you learned to make room for others. Walter Pewitt had done that with struggling families. Gideon and Ruth had done it for Megan. And now, without ever planning to, Megan was doing it for someone else. The girl who had once been afraid to unpack her suitcase had finally stopped asking whether she belonged. She was too busy building a place where someone else might discover that they did. And soon, one quiet question from a 16-year-old boy would make Megan understand exactly what Walter Pewitt had truly left behind. A few weeks later, the 16-year-old boy stayed behind after everyone else had left the workshop. He stood near the doorway, hands buried in his pockets. "Can I come back next week?" he asked. Megan stopped. For a moment, she remembered being 15 again, moving between homes, watching adults carefully, never unpacking everything because she never knew how long she would be allowed to stay. She remembered the night she left her foster parents. The pickup, the last $2,700 she had, and the broken farmhouse nobody wanted. Megan looked at the boy and smiled. You don't have to ask if you can come back. She paused. There's a place for you here. Only then did Megan understand what Walter Pewitt had truly left behind. It wasn't the cash beneath the basement. It wasn't the silver dollars. It wasn't even the 40 acres. Walter had spent his life giving struggling people something money alone could never provide. Time, dignity, and another chance. Gideon and Ruth had given Megan the same gift. And now it was hers to pass on. Megan once believed a home was simply a place no one could make you leave. She knew better now. A real home is a place where your dignity is safe and where you can make room for someone else who still needs to believe they belong. The girl who once never unpacked her suitcase had finally found where she belonged. And then she held the door open for someone else. If Megan's story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about second chances, kindness, and finding a place to belong. And tell us in the comments, what does home truly mean to you?